Beginnings. How the Julian Meetings Began by Hilary Wakeman. This is the introduction to Circles of Silence, a collection of articles from the first 21 years of JM. Nobody could have planned such a crazy thing. After a few years, we could see that it had all been done by the Holy Spirit. It certainly wasn't what I had in mind when, 21 years ago, I wrote a letter to some church papers asking if there were any other people who'd like to form a religious order for ordinary people of all denominations, living in the ordinary world but practicing contemplative prayer. It was 1973. Meditation was big. The very word was for most people synonymous with Eastern religions, and the influence of the Beatles was still strong in spreading transcendental meditation. As someone who had come through years of atheism and agnosticism back into Christianity with great joy, and had rediscovered the wordless and imageless prayer of my childhood, I was amazed that the Church was not speaking of its own tradition of meditation. Of course, there was a problem with words. To most Christians, meditation meant a thinking process, the mulling over of a biblical passage, for example, while the word in its Eastern sense was closer to what Christians call contemplative prayer. But why was no one talking about it, I wondered? Why were the churches letting so many people say that Christianity didn't have the real spirituality they were looking for and go all the way, metaphorically or physically, to the East for it? Initial thoughts. The letter came out of my own needs too. For local rather than theological reasons, I'd become a member of the Church of England. A desire for a greater sense of commitment almost led me to becoming a tertiary, a fringe member of an Anglican women's religious order. Very traditional, and furnished in every sense with polished Victorian gloom. A family crisis at the 11th hour prevented my formal reception, and within hours I saw that I had in fact been saved. I realised that what I was really looking for was something much broader. I wanted an ecumenical order based on the practice of contemplative prayer for ordinary people. No such order existed, I discovered. I didn't know where to start to make it exist, but there seemed some sort of inevitability about the need to try. I knew the Archbishop of Canterbury was Michael Ramsey, so I wrote to him. He replied that he would always encourage those called to live as an order, but that any such group had to make its own plans. But I didn't know any other people who wanted to be that group. I wrote to Archbishop Cardinal Heenan. He said that it might be better to become affiliated to something that already existed. I wrote to Metropolitan Anthony of Sourosh. He replied that he understood what I was aiming at, but that it had been tried before and had been a flop. So I wrote to the church papers. The letter was published by the Church Times, the Catholic Herald, the Baptist Times and Reform, the magazine of the United Reformed Church. It began by describing the turning east of so many and asked, might there not be, on an ecumenical basis, a coming together of Christian lay people interested in or already practising contemplative prayer or mystical prayer with a view to becoming a new type of order? An association of lay people of all branches of Christianity who wish to dedicate their lives formally to God. Married or unmarried, remaining in their own homes and occupations, living lives of simplicity and spiritual discipline, worshipping in their own churches, but coming together from time to time, being in some way visually identifiable by clothing or badge, and showing forth in the world joy and peace and love. Such an order would bring together those trying to combine contemplative and secular lives and commend this state to others. It would seek to attract those who would otherwise turn to Eastern religions or cults, and it might be a small but useful part of the ecumenical movement. Would anyone interested please get in touch with me? Response to my letter. The response was wonderful. Within a week or two, I had 166 letters. Dividing them geographically, I picked from each area one correspondent who seemed to be likely to be both enthusiastic and efficient. and wrote asking them to find a room in their city where we could meet on a particular date and a bed for the night for me. When the plans were made, others who had written from that area were informed. My husband agreed to look after our 5 young children for a few days, and in the last week of May 1973, I drove across the south of England to Oxford, Exeter and Chichester. Looking back, it was all very naive. If the organiser had been a mature member of the clergy, as I now am, it would have been very different, and the Julian meetings would probably never have happened. I had suggested that when we met, it should be for an afternoon and an evening, with occasional breaks for silent prayer or a bite to eat and a cup of tea. This was to give plenty of time just to talk, to find out why each one had responded and what we all really wanted. What people wanted, it turned out, was very different from what I had proposed in the letter. Of the 20 people who had written from the Oxford area, the 10 who met didn't like the word order and didn't want a rule of life. But they were a very ecumenical group and keen to start meeting regularly. At Exeter, the 4 people out of 14 who met said they wanted an order but no rule of life, and definitely no advertising. At Chichester, 6 very enthusiastic people met out of 11 and were keen to formulate a simple rule, to produce a book list and to have an annual national meeting. They arranged to meet monthly in the cathedral. 1 week in the following month, I drove up to Durham, Glasgow, Manchester and Leicester and met with people there. It began to be clear that what nearly everyone wanted was simply to meet regularly with others who practiced contemplative prayer. Many had met with incomprehension from their local clergy when they talked about it. Some had even been told that it was of the devil and should be abandoned at once. Quite a few had thought they must be going mad to pray in this way, since no one else they knew seemed to understand it. Their joy at finding others like them was marked, and the possibility of mutual support and encouragement was clearly what brought them together. Getting organised. A name, a magazine, and a national meeting. In the autumn, meetings were held in Cardiff, Cambridge, Kent and London, and by March 1974 the movement had a magazine and a name. We had asked for suggestions for a name, and the word Julian came from every quarter. This was partly because the 600th anniversary of the showings of Julian Norwich had been celebrated the previous year. But she also seemed the right name for us because, as she was pre-Reformation, we could in a sense all claim her. Also, as no one really knows whether she was a laywoman or a professed religious, she seemed right for a movement where already it was clear that clergy and lay people all met on an equal footing. So we became the Julian Meetings. It sounded fresh and simple. It was Canon Keith Walker, then of Chichester Cathedral, who organised our first national meeting. The Cowley Fathers welcomed 33 of us to their London house one day in December 1974. Some 20 JM groups were represented. Many talked of the need for the Church to take more seriously the teaching of prayer. An Anglican priest said that he was horrified when he asked a friend why she was about to follow an Eastern guru, and she said, "Because you have never taught me how to pray." It was agreed then that the purpose of the Julian meetings was to foster the practice and teaching of contemplative prayer within the Christian tradition. We talked about organisation and agreed that each group should develop in its own way and that central organisation should be minimal, with just a convener and 2 advisors. Initially, I was to be the convener and the advisors would be Keith Walker and Arthur Middleton, an Anglican priest from the northeast of England. It now seems odd that all 3 of us were Anglicans, a situation that hardly emphasised our ecumenical intentions, but one that would never happen again. Growing. There is something very precious about the early days of such a movement, when those who find themselves involved become grateful for each other's presence and enthusiastic about being part of this new and unique thing that is happening. Those who came to the 2nd annual meeting took on various tasks. A young Catholic poet and linguist from Cambridge, David Singleton, was to compile a list of the groups. Diana Rowantree, then an Anglican from Essex, was to find out if the original idea of an order was still viable. Brian Wills of the Society of Friends and from Hampshire would help me with the thrice-yearly newsletter, and his wife Pat would duplicate letters and forms. David Smith, an Anglican priest from Lincolnshire, volunteered to compile a list of speakers on prayer. And Maureen Greatrex, a young Anglican housewife from Cambridgeshire, agreed to organise the following year's conference. The advisors, we agreed, should be increased by 2, and they should not be Anglicans. We chose David Singleton and Brian Wills. That second national meeting was combined with a retreat led by the wonderful Cowley father, Christopher Bryant. And that set the pattern. Nearly every year there has been a national meeting combined with a retreat led by people like Martin Israel, Robert Llewelyn and Mary Holiday. The advisory group grew gradually and is now usually 9 to 10 people. We try to keep a balance of male or female, clergy, lay, north, south and of denominations. The number of groups grew. Some met in churches, chapels or church rooms, but many in private homes. Some met weekly, some monthly, some fortnightly. Most were evening groups, but older people often arranged daytime ones. Some groups were formed in hospitals, prisons, schools. 2 remarkable Anglican priests were responsible for JM starting in other countries. After a long correspondence with Kevin Joyner in Australia, the first JM group started there in 1980 and spread to New Zealand in 1981. In that same year, John Rowland began the first groups in South Africa. The United States took much longer. It wasn't until 1992 that an Episcopalian laywoman, Lynn Hay, inaugurated the first group there, which was in Illinois. The newsletter that we started evolved into something called the Julian Meetings magazine. It goes to all countries where there are groups, and each country inserts its own newsletter. For all but the first few years, the international magazine has been edited by Pamela Fawcett. The JM ethos. Since there are only 3 criteria for Julian groups, that they be Christ-centred, based on contemplative prayer, and at least potentially ecumenical, they could in theory be very different from each other. No laws are laid down as to the structure of meetings. Groups are encouraged to find out what is right for them. Yet, most of them eventually move into a common pattern of starting with a brief reading, having half an hour's silence, and ending with a prayer said together. While most participants are aware that there are other groups nationally, or even in their own area, it is the local group, the increasingly known, increasingly trusted men and women in the group, and the support they get and give, that is important to them. All that is best about the movement comes, I am sure, from its mixture of denominations. Because the best Julian groups include not only lay people but clergy from various local churches, there is not the usual expectation that the vicar or the minister will take the lead. Someone leads into the silence and out again at the end of the agreed time. But that will be a different person at each meeting and will be randomly clerical or lay. Sometimes it comes as a surprise to clergy how much they appreciate this opportunity to pray with others without having to lead. In some way connected to this playing down of differences, we tend not to use titles unless it is necessary. From fairly early on, we have just used first name and surname. It's not a rule. It just seems to have happened, and it feels right for us. There are now nearly 300 JM groups in the United Kingdom, but there is no membership as such. Those who meet in the groups pay nothing, though they may be subscribers to the Julian Meetings magazine, which is available to anyone. Despite the original letter, there is no badge or distinctive clothing. The movement has no headquarters, and it owns no property. The advisory group, which meets 2 or 3 times a year to make practical arrangements, keeps no minutes and has no elected officers. Members are selected by taking on various short-term or long-term tasks and working voluntarily and from home. At meetings of their local group, they are ordinary participants. But for many people, what is most vital about the Julian meetings, and the thing that differentiates us from other Christian meditation groups, is that they encourage those who are drawn to this way of prayer to find their own way into silence. To be restricted indefinitely to one particular technique is like being expected to live on baby food for 90 years. JM encourages people to know about different methods so that, not with flighty frequency, but when they feel called to it, they can move to a different approach. Misconceptions and realities. Since this whole book is about contemplative prayer, it may seem superfluous to attempt a basic statement of what it is. But there are some odd misconceptions around that it would be good to clear up. The worst misconception is that contemplation is letting the devil in. I've heard one or two ministers say this, and I've been appalled to think that they are depriving their people of a very deep experience of the presence of God through their own ignorance or fear. No prayer offered to God, no heart open to God can be said to produce evil. I believe that this thinking comes from the experience that some have when the mind is cleared of all that we have so deliberately kept it full of thoughts surfacing that have been long repressed. They surface precisely because they have not been dealt with. The solution is to bring them into God's light and allow God to heal us of whatever they represent. Pains and griefs, intolerable desires, or that side of ourselves which we know to be not altogether good. Another misconception is that contemplative prayer is difficult, and only for those who can give many hours to it. Anyone can do it, children can. Many of us can remember engaging with it as children, though we wouldn't have given it a name or thought we were doing anything in particular. And the adults around us would probably not have known what we were doing, or they may unknowingly have helped us by providing the surroundings that made it possible. Quiet churches, chapels, the open countryside, the sea. Although many books have been written about it, contemplative prayer is very simple. A stilling of the mind and body to attend God. All we need is a desire for God, for a closer relationship with God. And then, amazingly, God seems to do the rest, entices, rewards, draws us on, delights and encourages us, so that it is not a duty or a chore, but something we turn to very willingly, because it is deeply pleasurable. Wherever did we get the idea that we are not to enjoy God? Have a go. To anyone who has never tried to meditate, the bare statement that anyone can do it may be rather annoying, and so for anyone who wants to begin, I offer this basic lead-in. Find somewhere where you will be undisturbed. Sit comfortably upright. Decide how long you will spend in silence. Probably no more than 5 or 6 minutes to begin with, and commit that time to God. Consciously relax your body and let your breathing flow gently, but from right down in your diaphragm rather than your chest. Be aware of all that your senses can tell you, what you can see, smell, hear, taste and feel. Choose a God-centering word or phrase to take you into the silence. Close your eyes and begin not just to think it, but to say it in your mind over and over again, gently and in time with your breathing until it becomes drowned in silence. Be as still as you can, so that your body can find its own unity, and your mind and your heart can enter that unity. You will not need to try to be conscious of God. You have put yourself into God's keeping, and that is enough. When your time is up, mark the end of your silence with a brief prayer or a physical movement such as a sign of the cross or a bow of gratitude. What happens between the beginning and the end of your meditation will range from being indescribable to being boring. It may seem as if you have spent the time fighting off intrusive trivial thoughts or deeper anxieties or concerns. A good way of dealing with them is to recognise them and give them over to God, on the understanding that you will retrieve them and deal with them later, and thus go back to stillness. On some occasions you may experience a timelessness, an evenness quite featureless and yet sensed as containing all that is, from which you emerge with a calm joy, refreshed and recreated. No matter how the time of meditation is felt, it is always a precious exchange, your gift to God and God's gift to you. Once you know that you want to pray in this way, it's important to decide for how long and how often you will do it and to stick to it. Too short a time is better than an ambitious length that you will constantly fail to keep. With time, the practice changes us. We recognise it in ourselves, or others notice it. They comment that we're less grumbly or less uptight, more patient or more fair-minded. As we change for the better, the world changes for the better. Practitioners of transcendental meditation reckon that they can cut the crime rate in a given area if they can get 10% of the population meditating. Soka Gakkai Buddhists are, at the time I write this, chanting, arguably a form of meditation, for peace in Ireland and democracy in South Africa. Cynics will deny that meditation can have any effects on the social problems of the world. Yet even if we take the popular butterfly theory, that a butterfly moving its wings in Beijing can alter the climate in California, as no more than a pictorial way of saying that everything that happens affects the future of everything else, how can we doubt that millions of people engaging in a selfless state of goodwill can affect the state of the world? To join occasionally with other people who meditate can be a great encouragement, especially after the first flush of enthusiasm. At first it feels different to be in such utter silence with other people if you've been accustomed to meditating on your own, but then it becomes very precious and valuable. And your daily solo meditations are then upheld by the knowledge that those others are also praying in this way and in their own daily routines. Every day of the week, every day of the month, with the probable exception of Sundays and days like Christmas, Julian groups are meeting somewhere, together keeping a silence of rapt attention to God. They are ensuring that every day of the year, without exceptions, those thousands of people of every variety, alone or together, are turning to God in the contemplation that is beyond words and that daily brings the world and God closer together. The future. This book marks our 21st anniversary. In one sense, this saddens me. I wrote in our magazine on our 10th anniversary that I hoped we would not reach our 20th. What I meant was that I hoped that by then the prayer of silence would have become such a normal part of Christian life that there would no longer be any need for a network like JM. That hasn't happened, yet there still seems ground for hope that it will. More and more, people are asking for periods of silence during their church services. Increasingly, the wonder of silence is experienced at places like Taizé, or on a parish quiet day, or during a few days away at a retreat house. When this movement first started, most of us felt that attitudes to praying were polarised, with on the one extreme those who were drawn to the prayer of silence, and on the other those who prayed charismatically. Over the years, people have come to feel much freer about using both ways. Now we are enriched by being able to pray in many different ways. But there are still far too many people who have never experienced either way of praying, let alone both. There is still a sadly prevalent assumption that being a Christian is about going to church on Sundays and striving to be good the rest of the week. That's like getting married without being in love. The desire to worship God and live in union with God, to be good, flows naturally from the experience of God, but many need to be encouraged to allow themselves that experience. Maybe the Julian Meetings and other such movements still need to grow.